Everyone remembers what Green Bay got. Nobody talks about what Cleveland could have had and what that draft pick said about how badly they misread their own quarterback future. Not a running back, not defensive help, not a wide receiver. It's a quarterback that wasn't even supposed to be available when the Browns picked at 10th overall. This is the story of how Cleveland's front office in 2020 made a decision that looks worse every single year. We're breaking down exactly what the Browns were thinking when they let Jordan Love slip to the 26th pick, and why that one choice has defined their franchise regret ever since. Here's everything we know about their reasoning, what they prioritized instead, and how it shaped the next 6 years of Green Bay dominance. This is the path not taken. Here's every angle.
The Cleveland Browns in 2020 were a franchise coming off the worst stretch in modern NFL history. They'd been wrecked by quarterback uncertainty for 2 decades, a graveyard of failed draft picks, washed-up free agents, and panic moves. By 2019, they'd finally stabilized. Baker Mayfield as the young franchise face, a defense that was beginning to gel, and a winning record that felt like the start of something real. So when 2020 rolled around, the Browns' internal thinking, and this is what we believe was their calculus based on their public positioning, was fundamentally this: we have our quarterback. We need to build around him.
That mindset isn't crazy in isolation. Baker had shown flashes. The roster had talent. The thinking was draft help in the trenches, secondary, skill positions. Quarterback? That wasn't a position of need. That was a solved problem. But here's where the analysis gets interesting. The Browns didn't just think they had their QB locked in. They thought the QB position in that draft class wasn't worth the 10th pick anyway. The consensus pre-draft had 3 top-tier quarterback prospects in the early rounds: Joe Burrow, who'd go first to Cincinnati, Tua Tagovailoa, who'd go 5th to Miami, and Justin Herbert, who'd go 6th to LA. After those 3, the projection dropped off noticeably in most evaluations. Jordan Love was in that second tier. Talented, high ceiling, but raw. He'd had an incredible junior season at Utah State, but played in a smaller conference. Most analysts didn't see him as a certainty top 15 pick. By the time the Packers were on the clock at 26th, the assumption was Love might even fall into the second round. The Browns' calculation: why burn a first-round pick on QB uncertainty when the top 3 guys were already off the board? Here's what we believe the Browns prioritized that draft: a cornerstone defensive lineman and reinforcements that would make their defense elite right now. They needed a defensive anchor. The front office's strategy was built around the idea that you win in the NFL through defense and running the football, not by gambling on raw quarterback prospects in the mid-first round.
They didn't draft a QB at 10, they didn't draft a QB in the first round at all. Instead, they addressed what felt like immediate gaps in their roster construction. This was a win now while Baker is cheap mentality. But here's the speculation about what they were actually thinking. The Browns looked at the market and saw uncertainty everywhere. Baker was their guy. Why spend ammunition on a QB project when you could build a defense that could win playoff games? This reasoning made sense in 2020. It genuinely did. The Packers' decision to draft Love at 26 was considered slightly aggressive by some national analysts, a reaching move by a team with Aaron Rodgers locked in. That's the key context. Even Green Bay's move was viewed as somewhat audacious. The difference? Green Bay's front office saw something the Browns apparently didn't, that quarterback talent at that level of upside, even raw, even from a smaller program, wasn't going to be available much longer. They chose to gamble on the ceiling rather than assume the position was solved. This is where the Browns' thinking starts to age poorly almost immediately. We have to analyze what they believed about Baker Mayfield in 2020 versus what actually happened. Going into 2020, Baker had shown promise in his second season, but, and this is crucial to understanding the Browns' thinking, he hadn't shown elite consistency. He had massive variance, dominant games mixed with turnover-laden performances. The reasonable, defensible interpretation in 2020 was, this guy is still developing. He can be great. Let's build the team around him and see what he can become.
But what we now know, looking back 6 years, is that Baker plateaued. He never developed into a franchise-altering quarterback. He had good moments, injury-plagued stretches, and ultimately left Cleveland because the organization had lost faith. That's not on the Browns for believing in him in 2020. It's on them for not hedging their bet. Jordan Love, in the same time frame, was quietly developing in Green Bay's system, learning from Aaron Rodgers, and turning into the exact kind of mobile, efficient, high-ceiling quarterback that wins in the modern NFL. The Browns didn't just pass on Love because they thought QB wasn't a need. They passed on him because they were confident in their current trajectory, and that confidence was misplaced. That's the lens through which this decision looks catastrophic in hindsight.
Here's another angle on what the Browns were thinking: positional value hierarchy. The reasoning, based on their draft moves and public statements, was that cornerstone defensive linemen and premium secondary help would yield more wins per draft capital than a raw QB project. That's a legitimate framework. Defense does win championships. Run the ball, dominate the line of scrimmage, don't beat yourself. This was the thinking that dominated the Browns' building strategy in 2020. But what they fundamentally underestimated was this: in a salary cap era where QB is the leverage point for every major contract negotiation, having a young, cost-controlled, ascending quarterback is worth more than almost any single defender. And if you have a window where you can get one in the first round with actual upside, the leverage shifts dramatically. Green Bay understood this. Green Bay said, "We have Aaron Rodgers for maybe 2-3 more years at elite level. After that, we need to know if this next guy can carry the torch." That's not complicated thinking. It's just thinking one step ahead.
Green Bay understood this. Green Bay said, "We have Aaron Rodgers for maybe 2-3 more years at elite level. After that, we need to know if this next guy can carry the torch." That's not complicated thinking. It's just thinking one step ahead. The Browns were thinking, "We have Baker now. Let's maximize this roster right now." That's a valid competing philosophy. But in the NFL, the team that thinks about the quarterback position 3 years out typically wins the competition against the team that doesn't. By year 2, Jordan Love was starting to look like he could actually be something special. By year 3, he was getting meaningful snaps in meaningful games. By year 4, Green Bay had positioned him to be the franchise heir. Meanwhile, the Browns' defensive investments from 2020 and surrounding years, mixed results. Some hit, some didn't. That's how drafts work. But the fundamental asymmetry is this: even a decent young quarterback on a rookie contract is more valuable than even a great defensive lineman on year 5 salary expectations.
The narrative that emerges from this analysis is the Browns didn't just miss on Jordan Love. They failed to recognize that the 2020 draft presented them with an option, whether or not you use it immediately, to secure their long-term quarterback future. By passing on that option, they locked themselves into being dependent on Baker Mayfield's development, and when he didn't develop, they had no plan B. Green Bay had plan B. That's the difference. What we can reasonably infer about Cleveland's thinking in subsequent years is that once they'd passed on Love, they were essentially committed to the Baker era longer than was probably optimal. Front offices rarely admit this publicly, but it's reflected in their moves. They kept investing in the roster, the coaching staff, the infrastructure, all predicated on Baker being the long-term answer. When that faith eventually eroded, Cleveland had to search the free agent market for solutions. They cycled through desperation moves that cost draft capital and cap space. The team became reactive rather than proactive about the QB position. Compare that to Green Bay, which calmly waited, developed Love, and transitioned cleanly. The organizational stability looks completely different when you actually have a plan.
Now, in 2024 and beyond, the outcomes are stark. Jordan Love is a starting quarterback for an NFC North contender. He's ascending, efficient, and locked in long-term. The Packers position themselves perfectly for their next era. The Browns? They're searching for answers again. The QB situation is unsettled. They've invested enormous capital in trying to solve a problem that, we can reasonably speculate, wouldn't exist if they'd simply valued long-term quarterback timing the way Green Bay did. This is what hindsight reveals about the Browns' 2020 thinking. It was too present-focused. It assumed their current quarterback would develop into something he didn't. It underestimated the value of securing an elite option early. And it overlooked the simple fact that in football, you cannot have too many good quarterback options. You just have to manage them properly.
The story boils down to this. In 2020, the Browns believed they'd solved their quarterback problem with Baker Mayfield. They believed that drafting quarterback help at 10th overall was premature, unnecessary, and a waste of resources they needed elsewhere. They prioritized immediate roster construction over long-term position security. They looked at Jordan Love, raw from a smaller school, not consensus top 10, and decided he wasn't worth the investment at that moment. Green Bay looked at the same player and saw a franchise foundation. 6 years later, one team has a young QB locked in for the future. The other is still searching. The Browns' 2020 reasoning wasn't stupid, it was short-sighted. They had an option to secure their quarterback future and passed.
By the time they realized they needed to think long-term about the position, Love was already becoming something special in Green Bay, and Cleveland was left managing the consequences of a single draft decision.
Here's what we now understand about the Browns' 2020 thinking. It was predicated on false confidence in Baker Mayfield's ceiling and a misreading of how valuable early-round QB options actually are to franchise stability. They chose to build around an uncertain quarterback rather than secure their future. They chose short-term roster completion over long-term quarterback planning, and they've been paying for that choice ever since. Jordan Love isn't a Hall of Famer yet. The Packers' selection might not prove to be perfect, but the approach, valuing long-term quarterback security and being willing to invest in upside, is the approach that builds sustained competitive windows. The Browns' approach, assume your QB is set, optimize everything else, looks worse every year.